Imagine stepping onto a plane, ticket in hand, ready for a long flight in first class. But then a stranger points at you, her voice sharp, her words dripping with doubt. Are you sure this is your seat? Now imagine the crew, instead of defending you, hesitating, questioning, almost siding with her. How would you feel? What would you do? This is exactly what happened on Flight 857, where Dominic Hayes, a calm and dignified black man, was told he didn't belong in Seat 1A. But here's the twist. What no one around him realized was that Dominic wasn't just a passenger. He was the CEO. He owned the airline. What followed wasn't just a confrontation. It was the spark of a movement, a viral video, a global reckoning, and a new standard for dignity in the skies. So the question is, why does respect still feel like a privilege instead of a right? And what happens when the man they tried to humiliate holds the power to change everything? Stay with us, because this story will shake you. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support keeps these powerful stories alive. The morning light spilled through the tall windows of Terminal C, casting long golden streaks across the polished floor. Travelers hurried past with rolling bags and coffee cups, the familiar chorus of boarding announcements echoing above their heads. At Gate 47, the crowd gathered for Flight 857 to New York. Dominic Hayes adjusted the cuff of his simple navy jacket and moved quietly toward the line. He carried no entourage, no outward sign of who he was. Just a leather duffel bag slung over his shoulder, scuffed at the corners from years of use. To the casual eye, he looked like any other passenger, a man in his 40s with calm eyes and a steady walk. Few would have guessed that he was the majority owner and CEO of the very airline operating this flight. He liked it that way. Dominic believed in testing his company's culture from the ground up. That meant sitting in the waiting area, hearing the way agents spoke to nervous travelers, feeling the same subtle tensions other passengers endured. Most of all, it meant experiencing how his crew treated people when they thought nobody important was watching. As he reached the priority line, he gave a soft smile to the gate agent who scanned his pass. "Good morning," he said, voice low, warm. The agent barely glanced up, too focused on the endless stream of passengers. "Seat 1A, welcome aboard." Dominic stepped through the jet bridge. The familiar scent of recycled air mixed with brewed coffee greeted him as he entered the aircraft. He felt a quiet thrill, the same feeling he had as a boy watching planes lift into the sky. That feeling had never left him, even now when he owned fleets of them. First class shimmered with soft lighting, wide seats, and the hush of money. He walked to the first row, placed his duffel overhead, and settled into 1A by the window. He ran a hand along the armrest, letting the texture remind him of how far he had come. Memories surfaced, the cracked vinyl of a bus seat he once rode daily to school, the second-hand jackets his grandmother patched for him each winter. She used to tell him, "Dominic, dignity is something they can't strip away, unless you let them." He whispered the words under his breath, almost a prayer. Across the aisle, a well-dressed woman entered with confident steps. Catherine Monroe wore a tailored cream blazer, a pearl necklace, and the kind of expression that announced she was used to being obeyed. She paused, eyes narrowing as she spotted Dominic in 1A. A faint crease appeared between her brows. She looked at her boarding pass, then back at him. Instead of moving to her assigned seat, she stopped directly in front of him. "You're in my seat," she said flatly. Dominic looked up, calm as ever. "No, ma'am. This is 1A. It's on my boarding pass." Her lips pressed thin. "There must be some mistake. I fly this route every month. 1A is mine." He considered showing his pass right then, ending the tension before it began. But he stayed silent for a beat longer, curious to see what would unfold. A flight attendant hurried forward, drawn by Catherine's voice. "Brenda Collins, lead attendant on this flight," flashed Catherine a smile before turning to Dominic with a practiced firmness. "Sir, may I see your boarding pass?" "Please." Dominic reached calmly into his jacket pocket and handed it over. She scanned it quickly, then hesitated. Her eyes flicked between the paper and the man in the seat. "Well," she said, lowering her voice but not her suspicion, "we may need to double-check this with the gate. Sometimes upgrades cause confusion." Dominic met her gaze evenly. "It's a paid first-class ticket. Confirmed weeks ago." Catherine let out a short, sharp laugh. "Paid really?" She crossed her arms. "Look at him. Do you honestly believe he belongs in this seat?" A hush spread over the nearby rows. A businessman lowered his newspaper. Curious, a young student pulled out her phone, recording quietly. Dominic felt the weight of eyes pressing on him. Inside, a storm rumbled anger, shame, the memory of every moment he had been underestimated, yet he kept his breathing steady. He thought of his grandmother again, the strength in her voice when she said patience could be sharper than any blade. He turned to Brenda, voice even. "Check the manifest if you must, but I know where I belong." Brenda shifted uncomfortably, caught between two passengers. Catherine's confidence filled the silence. "I've flown with Legacy Airlines for 15 years, she declared. "I'm platinum. I know the crew. I always sit here. You need to move him." Dominic stayed still. He glanced out the window, where dawn painted the wing in silver light. He told himself, "Not yet. Don't reveal it yet. Let the truth ripen." The murmurs around them grew. The air thickened, tension coiling tighter with each second. Catherine's tone hardened. Brenda's posture stiffened, and Dominic's quiet resistance set the stage for a conflict no one in that cabin would forget. The plane was readying for takeoff, but inside first class, something much heavier was about to lift. The cabin had not yet filled when Catherine Monroe planted herself firmly in the aisle, staring Dominic Hayes down as though her presence alone should force him to surrender. Brenda Collins, the lead flight attendant, still held Dominic's boarding pass in her hand. Her lips were pressed together, her brows knitting as if she was deciding whether to honor the slip of paper or the confidence radiating from Catherine. Dominic felt the familiar heat of judgment pressing against his skin. It was a heat he had lived with his whole life, subtle in boardrooms, sharp on sidewalks, now condensed into the narrow aisle of first class. Yet outwardly he remained still. He folded his hands gently in his lap, his expression unreadable. "Miss Monroe, why don't you take your seat for now?" Brenda said finally. Her tone carried deference, the kind usually reserved for high-value customers. "I'll sort this out once everyone is boarded." Catherine's voice was clipped. "Sort it out now. I'm not sitting until this is fixed." She leaned closer, lowering her voice but ensuring those around could still hear. "This man is in my place. If you want this flight to leave on time, move him." Passengers nearby shifted uncomfortably. A businessman coughed, pretending to read emails. A couple in the second row exchanged uneasy glances. The young woman in seat 3B, Emily Carter, angled her phone slightly, recording without making it obvious. She had planned to review cases for law school on the flight, but now she had a front-row seat to something very different. Brenda exhaled slowly, then looked down at Dominic again. "Sir, it might be best if you allowed us to reseat you temporarily, just until we confirm everything with the gate." Dominic's voice was steady. "Respectfully, no." I booked 1A. This is where I belong." The words were simple, but the quiet conviction behind them landed like a stone in still water. Catherine scoffed. "Belong. Do you hear yourself?" she said. Her pearl necklace caught the cabin lights as she tilted her chin. "Look, I've been platinum with this airline longer than you've probably been flying. I don't know what scam you're pulling, but it ends now." Dominic inhaled deeply, feeling the sting of humiliation push at the edges of his calm. He remembered the countless times as a boy when store clerks shadowed him through aisles, assuming he was a thief. He remembered the college professor who once suggested he had taken someone else's spot, and he remembered his grandmother's firm grip on his hand after each moment, whispering that dignity required patience, but patience did not mean silence. "I am not moving," Dominic repeated softly. The firmness startled Brenda. She looked at Catherine, whose face flushed with irritation, and then at the line of boarding passengers stacking up behind them. The situation was quickly becoming a bottleneck. "Captain Owens will not be happy if we delay departure," Brenda muttered. She turned to Catherine. "Please, let me escort you to seat 2C for now. I promise I'll clear this up." Catherine shook her head violently. "Absolutely not. If you won't do your job, I'll call the captain myself." Her voice rose loud enough that more passengers began to pay attention. A ripple of whispers filled the cabin. Phones tilted discreetly toward the confrontation. Emily's recording continued, her heart pounding. She knew instinctively that what she was witnessing was bigger than a simple seating dispute. Dominic remained motionless, though inside a tide was building. He thought of his board of directors, of the executives who always demanded results. If he revealed himself now, the conflict would vanish instantly. Catherine would crumble, Brenda would apologize, and the flight would continue without delay. But what would that prove? That respect was tied only to status, that a man had to be powerful to be treated with basic dignity. He decided, not yet. The captain's voice broke through the tension, not in person, but through the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, who will be closing the doors in 5 minutes. Please take your seats so we can push back on schedule." Catherine's cheeks burned as if the announcement were aimed directly at her. She shot one more icy glare at Dominic before reluctantly sliding into 2C with a loud sigh. "This isn't over," she whispered. Making sure he heard, Dominic let the words wash over him without reply. He turned back toward the window, the wing gleaming under the morning sun. He pressed a hand briefly to the armrest, grounding himself. Brenda handed back his boarding pass, her expression tight. "Sir, I'll double-check with the manifest. If there's any mistake, I'll have to move you." Dominic looked at her, his gaze calm but piercing. "You'll find there isn't," she faltered, then gave a curt nod and walked briskly toward the galley. The next several minutes unfolded in uneasy silence. Passengers avoided eye contact, yet the energy in the cabin pulsed with unspoken judgment. Dominic could feel it pressing from every side, like invisible hands trying to shrink him down. He closed his eyes, steadying his breath. Inside, his thoughts clashed. Should he have stood up more forcefully? Was his restraint strength, or was it surrender? He thought about how often black travelers endured these moments, without the shield of power or money to protect them. He thought about how many quietly moved, choosing peace over confrontation, and how the silence slowly chipped away at the soul. The safety demonstration began. Flight attendants pointed toward exits, their smiles mechanical. Catherine sat rigid in 2C, arms crossed, her knee bouncing with impatience. She caught Dominic's eye once and smirked, as if victory were inevitable. As the plane pushed back and engines roared to life, Dominic felt his phone vibrate in his pocket. A message from his assistant blinked across the screen board: meeting at 2 p.m. Don't forget. He smiled faintly at the irony. Here he sat, questioned over a seat he rightfully owned, while later that same day he would decide the future of the airline itself. The aircraft lifted, engines surging, cabin trembling gently. Clouds swallowed the windows. Passengers settled. Headphones slid on. Laptops opened. But the storm in row 1 had not passed. It was only gathering force, waiting for the moment when silence would shatter and truth would thunder across the cabin. The plane leveled at cruising altitude, and the soft chime of the seatbelt sign rang overhead. A faint click followed as passengers unclipped their belts. The hum of engines filled the silence, steady and constant, but inside first class, the air carried another vibration, a tension not yet dissolved. Dominic Hayes adjusted in his seat and let his gaze wander across the cabin. A man 2 rows behind him peeked over the top of his tablet. A woman whispered to her partner, their voices barely a breath but eyes locked in his direction. The dispute from boarding still lingered like smoke that refused to clear. Catherine Monroe sat in 2C, arms crossed tight, posture upright as though she was bracing for turbulence. Every so often she glanced at Dominic with a look that carried both disdain and triumph. She had been forced to give up her claim for the moment, but the tilt of her chin made clear she considered the matter unresolved. The lead flight attendant, Brenda Collins, passed through the aisle with a stiff smile. When her eyes landed on Dominic, the smile faltered slightly, but she quickly regained composure and moved on, offering champagne to Catherine first. The gesture was not missed. Dominic folded his hands in his lap. The glass of water placed in front of him trembled slightly as the plane adjusted course. He stared into it, the ripples reminding him of the restlessness inside his chest. He had weathered boardroom betrayals, negotiated billion-dollar deals, and navigated political storms. Yet here, in this confined cabin, stripped of his title and influence, he was forced to prove something as basic as his right to sit in the seat he had paid for, across the aisle. Emily Carter's phone rested lightly in her hands. She had begun filming during the boarding scuffle, and now she scrolled through the short clip she captured. Catherine insisting 1A was hers. Brenda questioning Dominic, his calm refusal. Already. The clip had a dozen likes after she shared it in a private group chat. This is wild. One friend had replied, "Keep recording. People need to see this." Emily looked at Dominic again. He seemed composed, but his eyes carried a depth she could not quite describe, part steel, part sadness, part something she recognized as quiet defiance. She wondered if he knew she had been filming. Part of her hoped he did, that he would understand she was not a voyeur but a witness. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as breakfast service began. Brenda leaned closer to Catherine, voice low but audible enough for Dominic to catch fragments. "I'll talk to the captain once we finish meal service. We'll clear this up. Don't worry." Catherine smirked. "Satisfied?" "Good. People like that always try to sneak into places they don't belong." The words landed like ice in Dominic's chest. He inhaled slowly, fighting the instinct to react. A younger version of himself might have snapped back, might have demanded an apology. But years of endurance had taught him restraint. Still, restraint did not dull the sting. He thought of his grandmother again, her rough hands guiding his as he shelled peas in the kitchen. "They'll test you every day." Dom, she had told him, the question is not if. The question is how you'll answer. Dominic set down his fork untouched. His appetite had vanished, replaced by the gnawing weight of humiliation. He leaned his head back against the seat, eyes closing briefly. Inside, a storm of thoughts raged. Why was his dignity always negotiable in other people's eyes? How many times would he have to prove his worth before they saw him as he was, not as they assumed when he opened his eyes? He caught Emily's gaze. She looked away quickly, embarrassed at being caught staring. But then, almost shyly, she raised her phone slightly. The gesture was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Dominic understood. She was recording again, this time with intention. For a moment, their eyes locked, and something passed between them, an unspoken agreement. She would bear witness. He would hold steady. The clink of glasses and cutlery filled the cabin as attendants moved between rows. Catherine received her meal with exaggerated politeness, thanking Brenda loudly while glancing at Dominic as if to underline the disparity. Brenda, still tense, avoided meeting his eyes as she placed his tray down without a word. Dominic ate little, but each bite he forced down was measured, deliberate. He wanted no one to say he had been unruly, no one to claim he had caused trouble. Every gesture was a choice, every silence a strategy. Yet beneath the calm surface, the question pressed harder. When would silence cease to be strength and instead become surrender? The whispers continued. A passenger muttered, "Unbelievable." Another responded, "Just watch. You'll see." Laughter, quiet and uncomfortable, rippled from the back of the cabin. Emily captured it all, her fingers trembling slightly as she held her phone. She was no stranger to injustice. She had studied enough civil rights cases to know the patterns, but witnessing it unfold in real time, in the confined air of a plane, 30,000 feet above the ground, struck her differently. This was not history. This was happening now. Dominic placed his tray aside and folded his arms, staring out at the endless clouds below. For the first time, he considered cutting the moment short. He could reach into his pocket, make a single call, reveal who he truly was. With one sentence, the entire cabin would shift. The disdain would turn into apology, the whispers into silence. Catherine's smugness would dissolve. Brenda's nerves would shatter. But what would it mean that his humanity required revelation of power, that dignity was conditional, granted only when status was exposed? He clenched his jaw, steadying himself. No, not yet. The lesson had to be deeper. The truth had to surface when the contrast was undeniable. The captain's voice returned through the speakers, announcing weather ahead and a slight turbulence. Seatbelt signs lit again, and trays were cleared. The engines rumbled louder as the plane cut through a patch of rough air. Passengers gripped armrests, the momentary fear distracting them from the simmering conflict. When the turbulence passed, the silence that followed was thicker than before. Catherine leaned back, eyes closed, satisfied in her certainty. Brenda hovered at the galley, glancing toward Dominic with unease. Emily's phone remained poised, recording still. Dominic exhaled slowly, a whisper only he could hear escaping his lips. Patience. Dominic. Patience. The storm inside him had not quieted, but he knew it was gathering toward something inevitable. The whispers of the cabin were only the beginning. Soon, voices far beyond this aircraft would join, and the truth, his truth, would no longer be confined to row one. The cabin lights glowed soft and golden, but the atmosphere in first class was brittle, like glass on the verge of shattering. Breakfast trays had been cleared away. the scent of coffee still lingering faintly in the air. Conversations were hushed, as though the walls themselves held their breath. Yet every passenger knew the storm was not over. Dominic Hayes sat quietly in seat 1A, shoulders squared, eyes fixed on the horizon beyond the window. Clouds drifted below like white continents. To the casual observer, he looked calm, even detached. But inside, his thoughts were a battlefield. He had endured countless slights over the years, being followed in stores, mistaken for an assistant instead of the executive, ignored in rooms until he spoke with authority. He thought those wounds had hardened into scars, but in this cabin, with Catherine Monroe only a foot away, the old sting returned fresh, sharp as ever. Catherine leaned toward Brenda Collins, her voice cutting through the quiet like a blade. "Are we really going to let this continue? This man is sitting where he doesn't belong, and everyone knows it." Brenda gave a nervous glance at Dominic, then back at Catherine. "Please keep your voice down. Ms. Monroe, we're in the air now. I'll talk to the captain as soon as it's safe to step into the cockpit." Catherine scoffed audibly. "Safe what's unsafe about fixing a simple mistake. Unless, of course, you're afraid of offending him." She shot Dominic a look that carried open contempt. A murmur traveled through the cabin. Some passengers lowered their eyes to avoid being pulled into the dispute. Others shook their heads slightly, their discomfort visible but their silence firm. Dominic heard it all. Every word, every sideways glance pressed against him like weight on his chest. His hands curled into fists briefly before he forced them to relax. He reminded himself to breathe evenly, to keep his voice low, to control the urge to lash out. Yet deep inside, the question grew louder. Was silence protecting his dignity, or eroding it? He thought of his grandmother again. She had raised him on stories of resilience, teaching him that power often lay in restraint. But she had also warned him that silence could sometimes be misread as consent. There are moments, she had told him, when dignity means standing, not sitting. The words echoed now, bouncing against the cage of his patience. Emily Carter, the young woman in 3B, watched intently. Her phone lay angled against her lap, recording quietly. The longer she watched, the more her outrage grew. She had studied discrimination in classrooms, debated it in essays, but to see it unfold here, in real time, was something else. She could feel Dominic's restraint, the quiet storm behind his eyes, and it left her torn between admiration and fury. The turbulence returned briefly, jolting the plane. Trays rattled. A passenger gasped, and Catherine clutched her armrest. As soon as the cabin steadied again, her voice rose louder than before. "This is ridiculous. Oh, you know what? Brenda, I'll handle it myself." Before anyone could stop her, Catherine unbuckled and stood, her blazer brushing against Dominic's shoulder as she loomed over him. "You need to get out of this seat. Now, you're embarrassing yourself. And frankly, you're delaying everyone else's flight. Do the right thing and move to where you belong." The words hung in the air, heavy and merciless. Dominic turned his head slowly to face her. His eyes were steady, his jaw tight, the restraint in him strained like a rope pulled taut. Passengers leaned forward, sensing something irreversible about to unfold. "Sit down, Ms. Monroe," Dominic said quietly. His tone was not angry, but it carried a depth that silenced even the faint murmurs around them. Catherine blinked, startled by the firmness in his voice, but quickly recovered. "Don't you dare tell me what to do," she spat. "I've worked hard to earn this status, I've earned the right to sit in this seat. And you, she gestured at him with a dismissive wave of her hand, you're nothing but a liar trying to take advantage of the system. Gas rippled across the cabin. A man in the back muttered. She didn't just say that. Emily's camera caught every word, every flicker of emotion. Brenda rushed forward, her face pale. Ms. Monroe, please return to your seat. This is not acceptable. But Catherine refused to move. No, I won't sit until you do something. Call security when we land. Call whoever you need to. But I won't watch this airline let people like him cheat the system. The phrase people like him cut through Dominic like cold steel. For a moment, his vision blurred, his chest tightening. He gripped the armrest, grounding himself as fury surged. His entire life, his achievements, his very identity had been reduced to 4 words dripping with contempt. Inside, the rope of restraint finally began to fray. He imagined standing, revealing who he truly was, shattering Catherine's arrogance in a single stroke. He imagined the gasps, the apologies, the headlines, but another part of him whispered caution. If he revealed himself now, the lesson would be lost. Catherine's humiliation would overshadow the deeper truth that every passenger, regardless of power or wealth, deserved dignity without needing to prove status. He closed his eyes for a second, hearing his grandmother's voice again. Patience. Dom. But remember, patience is not silence. When he opened them, his decision was still unmade, hanging in the tense air between them. Catherine stood over him, face flushed with indignation. Brenda tried again, more urgently this time. Please, Ms. Monroe, for the safety of the flight, return to your seat. Catherine glared, but finally huffed and dropped back into 2C, muttering curses under her breath. The cabin exhaled as though it had been holding its breath. But the damage was done. The humiliation had already reached its peak, seared into every witness. The air itself seemed charged with the weight of injustice. Dominic sat unmoving, his face calm, but his thoughts a tempest. The breaking point was near. He could feel it. He knew the moment was coming when silence would no longer be possible, when the truth would demand to be spoken. Emily lowered her phone slightly, heart racing. She sensed it too. Whatever came next would not just resolve a seat dispute. It would ignite something far larger, something no one on Flight 857 would ever forget. And as the engines roared steady against the inn, the engines droned steadily as Flight 857 cut through the high clouds. But inside the first-class cabin, the air was sharp with tension. The earlier clash had not faded. If anything, it lingered like static. Every passenger acutely aware that what had unfolded was unfinished. Dominic Hayes sat in seat 1A, his posture a study in composure, though inside he felt the storm cresting. Catherine Monroe had quieted for now, but her presence across the aisle pulsed like a provocation. She tapped her fingers against her armrest, sighing loudly, throwing sharp glances his way as if daring him to look back. Brenda Collins, the lead flight attendant, avoided his eyes altogether, her face a mask of strained professionalism. Dominic's heart pounded with a rhythm that seemed to echo the engines outside. For the past hour, he had carried the weight of humiliation, swallowing each barb and letting silence speak in his stead. But silence had stretched thin, and dignity was beginning to demand its voice. When Brenda returned to check on the cabin, Catherine struck again. "Well, did you talk to the captain yet? Are you finally ready to fix this mistake?" Brenda faltered. "Ms. Monroe, we've confirmed the manifest. Seat 1A was purchased by Mr. Hayes weeks ago. There is no error." A ripple of acknowledgement passed through the passengers, but Catherine refused to concede. She leaned forward, her voice cold. "I don't believe it. People like him always find ways to game the system. Fake documents. Sweet-talking agents. It happens all the time. Just look at him." The cabin fell silent. Even the hum of the engine seemed muted under the weight of her words. Dominic's breath caught. He had promised himself patience, promised himself restraint, but something inside him shifted at that moment. It was not anger exactly, but a clarity so sharp it pierced through his chest. The line had been crossed. He reached calmly into his jacket pocket, drawing out his phone. With steady fingers, he dialed a number. The passengers leaned forward, sensing something unusual. Catherine smirked. "Oh, calling a lawyer. Are we?" Dominic didn't respond. He pressed the phone to his ear, his voice even. "Richard, patch me through to operations." A pause, then a clear voice on the other end. "Yes, Mr. Hayes. Right away." The cabin tilted with confusion. Brenda froze mid-step. Catherine blinked, frown deepening. Within seconds, a new voice came through the line, broadcast loud enough for nearby passengers to catch fragments. "Mr. Hayes, this is Michael Torres. What can I do for you?" Dominic's eyes met Catherine's as he spoke. "Michael, I'm on Flight 857 First Class Seat 1A. There has been an incident. A passenger and a member of your crew have questioned whether I belong here." Michael's voice sharpened instantly. "Sir, are you saying yes?" Dominic interrupted. Calm but firm. "I am saying I was told, in front of other passengers, that I did not belong in the seat I purchased. I want to know, right now, what Legacy Airlines intends to do about it." Gas rippled across the cabin. Heads turned. Emily Carter, the young law student in 3B, nearly dropped her phone in shock before realizing she was recording history. Catherine's face drained of color. "Wait, Legacy Airlines. What are you?" Dominic shifted slightly in his seat, voice steady but cutting through the air with quiet authority. "Ms. Monroe, let me be perfectly clear. I am not just a passenger on this airline. I am the majority owner and its chief executive. Legacy Airlines is mine." The words landed like thunder in the hushed cabin. Passengers gaped, mouths open. Someone whispered, "Oh my God!" Brenda's face turned pale, her hand clutching the edge of a seat for balance. Emily's recording caught every second the moment when contempt turned into disbelief, when humiliation flipped into revelation. Catherine's lips parted, but no sound came. She shook her head slowly, as though trying to dispel an illusion. That's impossible. You can't be." Dominic held her gaze. "You looked at me and saw a man who did not belong. But you never considered that the seat was mine, not only by purchase, but by right of ownership. The irony, Ms. Monroe, is that this entire aircraft, every seat, every mile it travels, already belongs to me." The silence afterward was absolute. It seemed even the engine softened for a moment, as if listening. Finally, Captain Richard Owens emerged from the cockpit, drawn by the disturbance. His uniform was immaculate, his expression stern. "What's happening here?" he asked, scanning the cabin. Brenda stammered, "Captain, there was a misunderstanding with the seating, but it's being handled." Dominic turned his gaze to the captain. Handled, his voice was calm, but steel ran beneath it. "I've been humiliated in front of your passengers. Your crew questioned whether I belonged here, despite my valid ticket. And one of your passengers decided to declare me an imposter. Does that sound handled to you?" Captain Owens froze, uncertainty flickering across his face. "Mr. Hayes, yes," Dominic said, rising slightly in his seat so the entire cabin could see him. "Dominic Hayes, CEO and majority owner of Legacy Airlines." Gas erupted again, louder this time. A woman in the second row clasped her mouth. A man whispered to his wife, "That's him. That's the guy from the Forbes cover." Emily's phone trembled in her grip. She knew this footage was about to explode across the internet. Catherine sat rigid, her hands clutching the armrest so tightly her knuckles whitened. Her eyes darted between Dominic, the captain, and the stunned passengers. The certainty she had worn like armor only minutes before had crumbled, leaving her exposed. Dominic's voice remained steady, but his words carried the weight of both judgment and grace. "The problem here is not my identity. The problem is the assumption that someone who looks like me cannot possibly belong in this seat. That is the real offense. That is what demands accountability." No one moved. No one spoke. Even the attendants from the galley stood frozen, their trays forgotten. Then, slowly, Dominic sat back down, placing his phone neatly on the armrest. His face was calm, but his eyes burned with quiet fire. "We will continue this flight, but know this when we land. The conversation will not end here. Legacy Airlines belongs to its passengers as much as it does to its shareholders. And today, it failed them." The passengers erupted into murmurs, some nodding in agreement, others still reeling from shock. Emily's recording light blinked red, capturing every frame. Catherine lowered her gaze, the defiance gone. For the first time since boarding, she looked uncertain, almost afraid. And in that moment, high above the earth, a simple truth rang louder than the engines. Dignity, once denied, had found its voice. For several long seconds, the cabin was a portrait of silence. The passengers sat frozen, their faces caught between awe and disbelief. The engines hummed beneath the stillness, but it was Dominic Hayes' voice that lingered, echoing in every ear. He had spoken without raising his tone, yet his words carried the weight of authority no one could deny. Captain Richard Owens remained by the cockpit door. His usually commanding presence diminished. He opened his mouth to speak but faltered, as though searching for the right balance between apology and explanation. Brenda Collins, who had stood tall moments before, now looked as though the ground beneath her had shifted. She clutched her hands together, her knuckles pale, eyes darting toward Dominic, but never quite meeting his gaze. Catherine Monroe sat stiffly in her seat, her pearl necklace trembling faintly with each rapid breath. She seemed smaller now, her earlier arrogance collapsing inward. She reached for her glass of champagne and took a shaky sip, but the gesture only highlighted her trembling hand. Dominic did not bask in their silence, nor did he gloat. Instead, he leaned back into 1A, his expression calm but unyielding. He allowed the weight of truth to do its work. He had no need to raise his voice or demand submission. The revelation itself had already rearranged the power in the room. Finally, Captain Owens cleared his throat. "Mr. Hayes," he began cautiously, I was not aware you were aboard today. If I had known Dominic's gaze lifted, steady and sharp, that's precisely the point. Captain, you should not need to know who I am in order to treat me with respect. My presence as a passenger should have been enough." The captain swallowed hard, nodding once, his shoulders tightening. "You're right, sir." Brenda stepped forward then, her voice trembling. "Mr. Hayes, I want to apologize. I didn't mean to question your right to be here. I was only trying to—" To keep the peace, Dominic finished for her. His tone was not cruel, but it cut through her excuse. Keeping the peace at the expense of dignity is not peace. It's complicity. Brenda's mouth opened, then closed again. Her eyes glistened faintly as she lowered her head. Catherine shifted uncomfortably, her pride still clinging to scraps of defense. "You could have said who you were from the start," she muttered. This wouldn't have gone so far. Dominic turned his head slowly, his eyes meeting hers with quiet intensity. "And why should I have had to? What if I were simply a teacher, a mechanic, a father on vacation? Would you have spoken to me the same way? Would you have assumed I did not belong? My identity should not have been the deciding factor in whether you respected me." Catherine's lips pressed tight, her eyes darting away. She found no answer. The murmurs among the passengers swelled, low at first, but growing louder. A businessman leaned forward. "He's right," he said, his voice carrying a tone of reluctant admiration. A woman beside him added softly, "We all saw what happened. It wasn't about the seat. It was about what you thought he couldn't be." Emily Carter's phone captured every word, her recording now an unbroken thread weaving together the story of a flight turned stage for truth. She felt her pulse race with the gravity of it. This was no longer just about a single seat. It was about something far larger, something raw and undeniable. Dominic let the murmurs swell before he spoke again. His voice was calm, yet firm enough to command the room. "I will not ask for apologies. Apologies are easy. What I ask for is reflection. Each of you witnessed how quickly assumptions were made, how easily judgment replaced respect. When we land, you will tell this story. I hope you tell it truthfully." The passengers listened in silence, many nodding slowly, some looking down in quiet shame. Dominic turned then to Captain Owens. "Ensure that the rest of this flight proceeds without incident. When we land, I will address the matter with operations." "Yeah, sir," the captain replied quickly, almost too quickly, before retreating back toward the cockpit. Brenda lingered, her eyes wet, her voice a whisper. "Mr. Hayes, I never wanted to hurt you." Dominic studied her for a moment, then spoke gently but firmly. "Intention does not erase impact. Remember that." Brenda nodded, her shoulders slumping as she stepped back, returning to the galley with the weight of his words pressing heavy against her. Catherine remained rigid in her seat, staring forward, her pride refusing to let her crumble fully in front of the others. Yet her silence was louder than any denial. For the first time, she looked like someone who no longer trusted her own footing. Dominic closed his eyes briefly, inhaling deeply. The storm inside him eased slightly, replaced by the cool clarity of having spoken truth aloud. He felt no triumph, no victory dance of ego. Instead, he felt the solemn gravity of responsibility. He had not just defended himself. He had exposed a wound that ran deeper than one flight, one seat, one insult. Emily Carter looked at him with wide eyes, her heart pounding with admiration. She wanted to speak, to thank him for his composure. But something about his stillness held her in reverent silence. She knew her recording would soon echo far beyond this cabin. The world would see what she had seen. The cabin gradually resumed the rhythms of flight, but the energy had shifted entirely. Conversations were hushed, but the tone was different now, curious, reflective, even guilty. Eyes that had once judged Dominic now lingered on him with respect, or at least with recognition of who he truly was. Catherine fidgeted. Her earlier certainty burned away. She reached for her champagne again, but her hand shook too much to lift the glass. She set it down quickly, folding her arms, staring blankly ahead. Dominic turned back toward the window, watching the endless expanse of sky. His reflection in the glass stared back, steady and calm. For the first time since boarding, the weight of humiliation had lifted. He had reclaimed his dignity not by power alone, but by refusing to surrender his voice. As the plane soared forward, Dominic felt the shape of what was to come. This story would not stay in the cabin. It would ripple outward, touching boardrooms, newsrooms, living rooms across the country. And when it did, it would demand more than apologies. It would demand change. The flight had settled back into its routines. But beneath the surface of ordinary motion, clinking glasses, the shuffle of feet toward the lavatory, something extraordinary was happening. The atmosphere in first class was no longer simply tense. It was charged, like the air before a storm. Emily Carter sat with her phone resting discreetly against the armrest of her seat. Her hands trembled as she watched the recording she had captured, her pulse racing. The entire confrontation, the disbelief, the insults, and then the reveal was there in crisp, undeniable clarity. She hadn't meant to become a reporter, but the weight of what she'd seen pressed heavily on her. Her friends had already blown up the group chat with messages. "Emily, post it. The world needs to see this." Another, "If you don't, I will." She hesitated. Posting could make her a target, but looking up at Dominic Hayes, calm, collected, now gazing out of the window with the dignity of someone who had endured far too much, she felt a rush of conviction. This wasn't just about one man or one flight. This was about truth. With trembling fingers, she hit upload. The video appeared first on her private social feed. Within minutes, her friends began sharing it. Then their friends. Then people she had never met before. The numbers began to climb: 10 shares, 50, 100. Comments flooded in. "Unbelievable. This is exactly what we talk about every day. Who are these people thinking they can treat someone like that?" She refreshed the screen again. The video had already been retweeted by a small local activist group, then a larger one, then a verified journalist. By the time the plane crossed into Ohio airspace, the clip had gathered thousands of views. The wildfire had started. Back in 1A, Dominic remained unaware of the growing storm online. His mind lingered on the confrontation, replaying Catherine Monroe's words. He wondered what his grandmother would say if she could see him now poised, controlled, but finally speaking truth when silence had run its course. He thought about the responsibility that came with his position. Owning an airline was not just business, it was trust. And today, trust had been broken in front of witnesses. Across the aisle, Catherine had shrunk into herself. Her earlier bravado was gone, replaced by a pale, rigid silence. She pretended to sleep, eyes squeezed shut, but her clenched jaw betrayed her. Each whisper from the cabin felt like a dagger. She could sense her name already being carried forward in hushed tones, her reputation unraveling one murmur at a time. Brenda Collins retreated to the galley, her movements slow, her shoulders heavy. She busied herself with stacking cups, though the trembling of her hands made even that difficult. She had served for 15 years, priding herself on composure, but now shame coursed through her. She could not shake the look in Dominic's eyes when he had said, "Complicity." The word replayed in her head like a bell she couldn't unhear. Passengers who had once remained silent began whispering more openly. "Did you hear, he's the CEO?" I saw the video. She's uploading it right now. This is going to be everywhere." In the row behind Dominic, a businessman typed furiously on his laptop, sending an email marked Urgent Subject Crisis Alert. Legacy Airline CEO on Flight 857. Possible PR disaster unfolding. He hit send before he even realized Emily's video was already making the same journey across cyberspace. By the time the aircraft crossed Pennsylvania skies, Emily's video had surpassed 50,000 views. A popular influencer had reposted it with the caption, "This is why dignity matters." The comments were exploding with outrage, solidarity, and disbelief. Some praised Dominic's calmness. Others condemned Catherine's arrogance. A few asked the inevitable. How many times does this happen to people who aren't CEOs? Dominic, still in quiet thought, sensed the shift around him. Passengers stole glances his way, not the skeptical, dismissive looks from before, but something closer to reverence, or perhaps guilt. He wondered if they saw him differently now because of who he was, or because he had forced them to confront what they had ignored. Emily's phone buzzed nonstop with notifications. She covered her mouth, overwhelmed as she realized the clip had just been shared by a major news outlet. A journalist had captioned it, "White woman challenges black passenger over first-class seat." Then he reveals he owns the airline. Emily's breath caught. The story had already left the plane. By the time they landed, the world would be waiting. Catherine opened her eyes at last, glancing nervously around. She noticed passengers scrolling their phones, whispering, looking at her. Her cheeks flushed hot. She reached for her champagne again, but it was warm and flat. She set it down untouched. For the first time in years, she felt the sting of exposure, of being the one judged instead of the one doing the judging. Dominic finally pulled out his own phone. Dozens of unread messages glowed across the screen, missed calls, urgent texts. His communications director, Sophia Miller, had sent a string of alerts. "Dominic, the video is out. Call me as soon as you can. This is going global." He leaned back, exhaling slowly. He had known the incident would not stay confined to the cabin, but he hadn't expected it to ignite this quickly, this fiercely. He looked out at the clouds once more, the horizon stretching endless and bright. Somewhere deep inside, he felt the weight of history pressing against the present. This was not just his story anymore. It was becoming everyone's. Emily caught his gaze for a moment and gave a small, almost apologetic nod, as if to confess she had been the one to release the spark. Dominic studied her, then offered the faintest smile, a silent acknowledgement that he understood, that sometimes truth needed a witness brave enough to speak. The chime overhead signaled their descent toward New York. Passengers straightened their seats, trays locked, belts fastened, but no one was thinking about landing. Their minds were elsewhere, on the confrontation that had shaken the cabin and the storm waiting for them on the ground. Catherine gripped her armrest tighter, wishing she could disappear into the seat. Brenda rehearsed apologies in her mind, though she knew none would be enough. Emily checked her phone one last time, watching the numbers surge into the hundreds of thousands, and Dominic Hayes closed his eyes briefly, gathering strength for what awaited. When the wheels touched down, it would no longer be a story contained to 30,000 feet. It would be a reckoning broadcast across the nation. The descent into New York began with the familiar chime, but nothing about the atmosphere inside the cabin felt routine. Seat backs clicked upright, trays snapped closed, and window shades lifted. Yet the gestures were mechanical, half-conscious, Everyone's mind was fixed on something else. Dominic Hayes sat in 1A, gazing out as the quilt of the city spread below bridges stretched like arms across the water, buildings rising from the haze of morning light. He felt the subtle shift as the plane tilted into its final approach, engines humming lower, but his thoughts were already ahead, on the terminal, the crowd, the questions waiting like wolves. His phone buzzed again. Another message from Sophia Miller, his communications director media at JFK already. Statement needed. Do not speak off the cuff. Call me the moment you land. Dominic sighed softly. He had lived through corporate crises, mergers gone wrong, shareholder lawsuits, even engine recalls. But nothing felt quite like this. This was not about profit margins or regulatory fines. This was about dignity, humanity, the kind of truth that spilled beyond boardrooms into living rooms, classrooms, protests in the street. Catherine Monroe shifted nervously in her seat across the aisle. Her earlier arrogance had evaporated entirely. She had tried to sleep but failed. Her thoughts tangled in panic. She could sense it already, her words echoing online. Strangers dissecting her expression, her tone, her very character. The humiliation she had sought to heap on Dominic had recoiled, curling around her instead. She turned toward Brenda Collins, whispering urgently, "Do something. Can't we get off the plane quietly? There will be cameras." Brenda, pale and exhausted, shook her head. "It's out of my hands now." Her voice carried a defeated tremor. Emily Carter clutched her phone, watching the numbers climb past 500,000 views. She had tried to stay calm, but the weight of what she had unleashed pressed against her chest. She hadn't expected it to explode this fast. Now, she realized, she was no longer just a passenger. She was a witness, maybe even a catalyst. The world would want to know her name, to hear her story. The wheels touched the runway with a heavy thud, the cabin shaking as engines roared in reverse. Gas and exhales rippled through the rows. But it was not the landing that stole their breath. It was the knowledge that when those doors opened, they would step into a storm. The plane rolled toward the gate, slowing gradually. Dominic straightened his jacket, buttoned the top of his shirt. He had faced presidents and prime ministers, but the idea of facing the raw gaze of the public, angry, expectant, demanding, felt different. This was not a deal he could negotiate quietly behind closed doors. This was history unfolding under the glare of every lens. As they reached the gate, passengers craned to look out the windows. Cameras clustered along the jet bridge. Security officers stood in position. Airline executives in dark suits waited stiffly near the glass, their expressions taut. The intercom crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to New York. Please remain seated until the seatbelt sign is switched off." But no one moved. Eyes flicked toward Dominic, toward Catherine, toward the aisle where history was about to walk. The chime released them at last. Belts snapped open. Overhead bins swung wide, bags thumped onto seats. Yet still, no one rushed to disembark. They lingered, drawn into the gravity of what was about to happen. Brenda stepped into the aisle, her voice shaky. "Mr. Hayes, if you'd like, I can escort you off first." Dominic looked up at her. For a moment, she expected him to lash out, to demand she step aside. Instead, he spoke evenly. "No, everyone will leave together. What happened here was public. The exit will be the same." Passengers murmured, nodding, some with admiration, others with nervous anticipation. Catherine sank lower in her seat, hoping somehow the crowd outside wouldn't recognize her. She pulled her jacket tighter, as if fabric alone could shield her from the torrent waiting at the gate. Emily pressed record one more time, her phone steady now. She knew this moment Dominic walking off that plane would become iconic. She wanted the world to see it unbroken, raw. The doors opened with a hiss. Light poured into the cabin. Voices swelled from the jet bridge, a sea of shouts and questions tumbling together. Dominic rose slowly from 1A. He adjusted his jacket once more, then stepped into the aisle. The passengers behind him instinctively parted, forming a narrow corridor. It reminded him of something ceremonial, almost sacred, like the space carved out for truth to pass through. As he walked forward, heads bowed slightly, not out of deference to his power, but in recognition of the dignity he carried. Some passengers whispered words of support. "Thank you. Stay strong. We're with you." Catherine shrank deeper into her seat, praying the cameras would miss her. Brenda followed several paces behind Dominic, her steps heavy, her eyes wet. She was no longer just a flight attendant. She was part of the story now, and she knew it. The moment Dominic stepped onto the jet bridge, the flash of cameras erupted. Reporters shouted questions in rapid fire. "Miss Hayes, how do you respond to the incident on board? Do you believe this was racially motivated? What reforms will you implement?" He paused, the wall of sound pressing against him. He could answer now, raw and unprepared, or he could wait, gather his team, speak with intention. The latter was wiser. He knew, but the temptation to speak from the heart clawed at him. He turned briefly, glancing back toward the cabin. Catherine was still hidden in her seat, face half covered by her hands. Brenda stood frozen in the aisle, her guilt painted across her features. Emily's phone caught at all the juxtaposition of shame, fear, and dignity walking side by side. Dominic faced the cameras again, his voice low but clear. "I will speak soon. Not here. Not like this. But know this: every passenger deserves respect, without condition. That is the only statement I will make today." Gasps, murmurs, and more shouted questions followed as security ushered him toward the terminal. But the words had already landed. Simple, resolute, impossible to twist. Inside the terminal, his executive team waited. Sophia Miller pushed forward, her phone in one hand, her face etched with urgency. "Dominic, the story is already global. CNN, BBC, everywhere. We need to respond within the hour. The board is calling an emergency session." Michael Torres, Operations VP, nodded grimly. The FAO is asking questions, too. They want a briefing. Jonathan Reed, his legal counsel, adjusted his tie. "We have to tread carefully. This isn't just PR. It could have regulatory implications." Dominic listened, absorbing their words, but his eyes drifted back toward the gate. Passengers were beginning to spill out now, whispering to reporters, pointing, gesturing. Catherine slipped through the crowd, her face hidden, but the cameras followed anyway. Brenda walked stiffly, clutching her bag, her eyes red. Emily emerged last, her phone still recording, her gaze steady. Dominic met her eyes across the chaos. She gave a small nod, a silent acknowledgement that she had carried the story into the world. Dominic exhaled deeply. The storm had broken, and there was no turning back. The glass tower of Legacy Airlines headquarters glinted in the afternoon sun, a sharp silhouette against the New York skyline. Inside, the executive boardroom hummed with a nervous energy. The mahogany table, polished to a mirror sheen, stretched the length of the room, but the reflection it cast was fractured. Half-finished coffee cups, rumpled papers, and hastily opened laptops cluttered its surface. Dominic Hayes entered without ceremony, his steps even, his expression controlled. He wore no tie, his jacket still the same one from the flight, a reminder that the incident was not yet a memory, but a fresh wound. The room fell silent at once. Every executive, every advisor turned toward him. Some eyes carried fear, others shame, and a few flickered with defiance. Sophia Miller, his communications director, sat closest to the door. Her phone lay on the table, screen lit with notifications that seemed endless. "Dominic," she said quickly. "The video has crossed 3 million views. Every major network is covering it. Hashtags are trending globally." Michael Torres, the operations VP, leaned forward, voice low and urgent. "The FAA has called twice. They want a full report on what happened on Flight 837. They're using the word civil rights violation." Jonathan Reed, legal counsel, adjusted his glasses. "We can get ahead of this, but we have to be precise. One wrong word could turn this into regulatory disaster. Investors are already nervous." Stock dropped 5% in the last hour. Around the table, murmurs rippled numbers, risks, liabilities. They spoke the language of damage control, of minimizing fallout. Dominic raised a hand, and the room fell silent again. His voice was calm, but every word landed with weight. "Let's not forget what this is really about. This isn't just about one flight. This is about dignity. It is about the fact that passenger staff and the world saw an airline question whether a black man belonged in first class even when he owned the airline itself. That cannot be explained away with a press release." The words cut through the room. Some executives shifted uncomfortably, staring at their notes. Others avoided his gaze. Sophia cleared her throat. "Then we need a message that goes beyond apology. Something that shows structural change," Michael interjected, his tone defensive. "But Dominic, let's be pragmatic. The union will fight any immediate firings. If we move too fast, we'll face lawsuits. We can't just throw staff under the bus." Dominic turned his gaze on him, steady and unblinking. "Michael, people watched as our staff failed to uphold the most basic principle of respect. They didn't just mishandle a seat dispute. They humiliated a passenger based on assumption. You call that throwing staff under the bus? I call it accountability." Michael's jaw tightened, but he said nothing more. Jonathan spoke carefully. "We can position this as an opportunity. Announce mandatory retraining, create an independent review board, implement a reporting hotline. It will show the public we're serious about reform." Dominic leaned forward, his hands resting firmly on the table. "Not enough. Retraining is a bandage. This wound is deeper. We need systemic change, structural reforms that make dignity non-negotiable. I want every complaint reviewed by an independent panel with real authority. I want every crew member evaluated not just on performance, but on respect. And I want transparency, numbers, metrics, outcomes, published quarterly for the world to see." Sophia nodded quickly. "That will resonate? It's bold. It's what the public wants to hear. But it's more than what they want to hear," Dominic replied. His voice softened, carrying the gravity of conviction. "It's what they deserve. For too long, companies have apologized and moved on. Not this time. Not my company." A silence settled over the boardroom, heavy but electric. For a moment, no one spoke. Then an older board member cleared his throat. "Dominic, if I may, you're right. But you also know this will cost us. Training programs, oversight committees, compensation funds. We're talking hundreds of millions." Dominic looked him directly in the eye. "And what is the cost of dignity? What is the price of a passenger's humanity? If we can spend billions on aircraft, we can invest millions in respect. The board member lowered his gaze. Sophia tapped her pen against her notebook. We'll need a name, a program title, something that can be repeated, remembered, shared. Dominic paused, then said quietly, the Equal Sky Protocol, because no one who boards a plane should feel smaller than the seat they're given. We all fly under the same sky. The phrase hung in the air, powerful, undeniable. Several executives nodded slowly. Jonathan scribbled it into his notes. Sophia repeated it under her breath, already imagining it on headlines, press releases, campaign slogans. Michael, still uneasy, raised one final objection. But Dominic, if we admit fault this openly, if we name it and brand it, aren't we giving ammunition to lawsuits? Investors will panic. Dominic leaned back, his eyes fixed firmly on Michael. If investors want an airline that profits by silence, they can invest elsewhere. Legacy airlines will profit by trust, and trust begins with truth. The room was silent again, but this time it was not avoidance. It was the silence of realization, of a tide turning. Sophia finally broke it, her voice steady. Then we'll draft the announcement tonight. Equal Sky Protocol, full reforms, transparency, accountability. Dominic, the world is watching. Let's give them more than words. Dominic nodded slowly. We will, and we'll begin with tomorrow morning's press conference. No scripts, no spin, just truth. The meeting broke, but the energy in the room remained charged. Executives filed out, whispering to one another, already calculating costs, risks, and strategies. Sophia lingered behind, her eyes on Dominic. Are you ready for this? She asked softly. Dominic exhaled, his gaze drifting toward the Manhattan skyline. I've been preparing my whole life. I just didn't know this would be the stage. Sophia studied him for a moment, then gave a faint smile. The world is going to remember this, Dominic. Not just for what happened on that flight, but for what comes after. Dominic looked out the window, the city shimmering in the fading light. He thought of the cabin, the whispers, the humiliation, and the reveal. He thought of Catherine's trembling hands, Brenda's guilty eyes, Emily's steady recording, and he thought of his grandmother's voice, always guiding him. They'll test you every day, Dom. The question is not if, the question is how you'll answer. He had answered, but now the world awaited his next words. Morning light streamed through the tall windows of the Legacy Airlines Media Hall in Manhattan. The room, usually reserved for quarterly earnings briefings, now carried the tension of history pressing down on it. Rows of cameras lined the back wall, their lenses already trained on the podium. Reporters filled every seat, murmuring in anticipation, their notebooks and phones ready to capture every word. The Equal Sky Protocol had been drafted overnight, its principles outlined in documents that now sat on each executive's desk. But this morning was not about memos. It was about voice. It was about truth spoken plainly. Dominic Hayes stood behind the curtain, his reflection in a narrow mirror staring back at him. He adjusted his jacket, ran a hand down the crease of his sleeve. His grandmother's words echoed in his mind again. There are moments when patience must give way to voice. Sophia Miller stood beside him, her voice low and steady. The world is watching. Keep it simple. Keep it human. That's what they'll remember. Dominic nodded once. I don't want them to remember me. I want them to remember the message. A stage manager gave the signal. The curtain parted. The flash of cameras struck immediately. A wall of light. Dominic walked to the podium, his stride measured, his expression calm but unyielding. He placed his notes on the stand, but didn't look at them. Instead, he raised his eyes to meet the crowd. "Good morning," he began, his voice steady, carrying across the room without need for amplification. "My name is Dominic Hayes. I am the CEO and majority owner of Legacy Airlines. And I was the passenger in seat 1A on Flight 857. A murmur rippled through the room. Reporters leaned forward, pens scratching faster, fingers tapping across keyboards. "I want to speak plainly," Dominic continued. "On that flight, I was questioned, not because my ticket was invalid, not because there was a mistake in the system, but because of an assumption that I could not possibly belong where I was seated. That assumption did not come from a policy. It came from a perception. And that perception is rooted in something deeper, something systemic, something we must confront." The room stilled. "Let me be clear," he said, his voice firming. "This is not about one passenger, or one crew member, or one airline. This is about dignity. The dignity every person is entitled to the moment they step onto an aircraft, or into a store, or a school, or a workplace. The dignity that should never depend on the color of their skin, the clothes they wear, or the name on their boarding pass." Flashbulbs erupted again, capturing his steady gaze, the quiet strength in his stance. I could have ended the confrontation by revealing who I was sooner. But ask yourself, should I have had to? Should anyone need to justify their presence, their humanity, with power or wealth or title? If dignity only belongs to those with influence, then it is not dignity at all. It is privilege. His words struck the room with the clarity of truth. Some reporters stopped taking notes, simply listening. "That is why," Dominic continued, "Legacy Airlines is launching the Equal Sky Protocol. This is not a slogan. This is a binding commitment to structural change, effective immediately. Every complaint of bias will be reviewed by an independent panel with authority to act. Every employee will be trained not just in service, but in respect. Our data on complaints, actions, and resolutions will be published quarterly, available to the public. Transparency will be our standard. Accountability will be our promise." He paused, letting the words settle. "Some will say this is too much, that it will cost too much, that it will take too long. To them I ask, what is the cost of humiliation? What is the price of a child watching their parent disrespected? Of a student learning that their skin color defines where they belong? If we can measure profit in billions, we can measure dignity in millions and still call it a bargain." Applause broke out from a section of the room, hesitant at first, but swelling quickly. Cameras clicked like rain. Dominic raised a hand gently, quieting the room again. "This is not just about Legacy Airlines. I call on every airline, every transportation company, every business that serves the public, join us. Adopt your own protocols. Make dignity non-negotiable, because the sky belongs to all of us, equally." His voice softened for the close, carrying a note of resolve. "I did not choose what happened on Flight 857, but I will choose what comes after. Equal sky begins today, and it will not end until respect is as common as a boarding pass." The room erupted, questions shouted, cameras flashing, applause mingling with noise. Dominic stepped back from the podium. He gave a single nod to Sophia, who waited in the wings, then turned and left the stage. Behind the curtain, Sophia's eyes shone with restrained emotion. "That," she whispered, "was exactly what the world needed to hear." Dominic exhaled, the weight on his chest easing slightly. But he knew this was only the beginning. Speeches sparked change, but systems sustained it. The real work was ahead. Out in the press hall, reporters scrambled to push stories live. Headlines formed in real time. Equal Sky Protocol announced after CEO confronted on flight. Dominic Hayes' dignity is not privilege. Legacy Airlines promises unprecedented transparency. Meanwhile, in living rooms and offices across the country, people watched the live stream, some with tears, others with clenched fists. Parents pointed to the screen, telling their children, "Remember this." And in one quiet apartment, Catherine Monroe sat alone, watching the same broadcast, her face pale, her phone buzzing nonstop with messages she refused to open. She saw Dominic's calm, steady presence. She heard his words, words that pierced through her shame like glass breaking. For the first time, she wondered if she would ever be remembered for anything other than this moment. Brenda Collins, too, watched from her small hotel room near the airport, still in uniform but slumped on the bed. Tears streaked her cheeks as she replayed the recording, Dominic's voice echoing complicity. She had thought her years of service would define her. Now she feared this mistake might eclipse it all. Emily Carter, back at her campus apartment, refreshed her phone, watching her video surpass 10 million views. She felt overwhelmed, but proud. For once, her voice had carried, and it had mattered. In the Legacy Airlines boardroom, executives monitored the reaction in real time. Some whispered anxiously about costs, lawsuits, and stock prices, but others nodded quietly, sensing something larger. For once, the numbers on their screens weren't just about profit. They were about change, and in the center of it all, Dominic Hayes sat alone in his office, the city skyline stretching beyond the glass. He knew the applause would fade, the headlines would shift, but the commitment would remain. He had made it public, irrevocable. The Equal Sky Protocol had taken flight, and like the aircraft he owned, it would carry more than passengers. It would carry hope, dignity, and the weight of justice into the skies. By noon, less than 3 hours after Dominic Hayes walked away from the podium, the world was already reshaping around his words. News alerts stacked across phone screens. Social media swarmed with clips from the press conference, hashtags climbing into the millions. Equal Sky. Your dignity is not privilege. Seat 1A. In office break rooms, televisions flickered with his calm face and his piercing declaration, "If dignity only belongs to those with influence, then it is not dignity at all. It is privilege." Parents replayed the clip for their children. College professors streamed it in lecture halls. Civil rights groups issued statements of support, calling it a turning point, a reminder that structural bias could no longer hide behind polite excuses. Airlines across the industry felt the shockwave immediately. Rivals scrambled to release carefully worded statements, pledges to review existing policies, promises of renewed commitment to customer respect. But passengers weren't satisfied. Screenshots of Dominic's words flooded timelines alongside demands for other airlines to match Legacy's Equal Sky Protocol. The FAA issued a brief notice that it was in communication with Legacy Airlines regarding new compliance measures. Behind the scenes, regulators were already drafting memos about how Equal Sky might become a federal standard. In Washington, a senator tweeted, "Dignity cannot be optional. I applaud Dominic Hayes for leading. Congress must follow." The tweet was shared over 200,000 times within an hour. While institutions scrambled, individuals wrestled with their own reckonings. Catherine Monroe sat in her upscale apartment on the Upper East Side, blinds drawn, the hum of the city muffled. Her phone buzzed relentlessly. Reporters, friends, strangers. Her name was trending, her face plastered across millions of feeds. Clips slowed down her dismissive sneer, her pointed words. People like him always find ways to game the system. She stared at the screen, replaying the moment until the sound of her own voice made her wince. Comments piled beneath racist, entitled, "This is what we deal with daily." Others were less measured, cruel in their fury. For the first time, Catherine felt powerless. No network of privilege, no cocktail parties, no expensive vacations could shield her from the glare of public shame. She considered drafting an apology, but every word sounded hollow. She closed her laptop, buried her face in her hands, and wept into the quiet of a gilded cage. Brenda Collins, meanwhile, sat in her modest hotel room near JFK. Her uniform jacket hung limp over the chair, her name tag still pinned. She scrolled through the headlines, each one cutting deeper. Flight attendant questions CEO in viral bias incident. Complicity at 30,000 feet. Tears stung her eyes. 15 years of service, countless hours in the sky, and now she was branded by one moment. She thought of Dominic's words, "Intention does not erase impact." She had wanted to calm the situation, to quiet the storm, but in doing so she had betrayed her duty to stand for fairness. Her phone buzzed with a message from her teenage daughter, "Mom, are you okay? People at school are talking about you. I don't know what to say." Brenda's chest tightened. She typed and erased a dozen responses before settling on the only truth she could offer. "I made a mistake. I'll try to make it right." Back on campus, Emily Carter refreshed her feed, her video now at 25 million views. She scrolled through comments calling her a hero, praising her courage. News outlets had reached out for interviews. Professors emailed to congratulate her for bearing witness. But Emily felt conflicted. She hadn't set out to be a hero. She just pressed record. Still, she remembered Dominic's faint smile on the plane, the silent acknowledgement between them. That was enough. She knew she had done the right thing. Inside Legacy Airline's headquarters, the ripple effect took on a different form. Emails poured in from passengers sharing their own stories of bias, some small, others harrowing. A grandmother recounted being asked to prove she belonged in business class. A teenager described being accused of stealing headphones he had bought in duty-free. Each message was a reminder Flight 857 was not an exception. It was a symptom. Sophia Miller organized the influx, categorizing stories into themes, drafting a plan to highlight them in quarterly reports. "The world is ready for transparency," she told Dominic. "Let's give it to them." Michael Torres, still uneasy, focused on operations. "We'll need to retrain thousands of crew members. This isn't just policy, it's culture. That won't change overnight." Dominic's response was steady. "It doesn't need to change overnight, but it needs to start today." That evening, television networks aired special segments. Civil rights leaders praised the Equal Sky Protocol as a model for corporate accountability. Commentators debated whether other industries, hospitality, retail, even banking should adopt similar transparency. Some skeptics dismissed it as performative, but the voices of those who had lived the reality drowned them out. In living rooms, families discussed dignity in ways they hadn't before. Children asked questions their parents struggled to answer. Why didn't they think he belonged? Would that happen to me? Dominic watched some of the coverage from his office, the city glowing beyond the glass. He felt the enormity of the moment pressing against him, heavier than any corporate deal he had ever brokered. He hadn't asked to become a symbol, but symbols weren't chosen, they were forged by fire. He thought again of his grandmother, her voice carrying across years, The question is not if. The question is how you'll answer. He had answered on Flight 857. He had answered in the boardroom. He had answered at the podium. And now the world was answering back. For Catherine, the answer was silence, isolation, the mirror of her own words staring back at her. For Brenda, it was guilt, tempered by a glimmer of resolve to rebuild. For Emily, it was validation that one act of witness could ripple across the globe. And for Dominic, it was clarity. This was no longer about him. It was about everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong, who had been humiliated in silence. Equal sky was no longer just a protocol. It was a promise. He closed his eyes, breathing deeply, the hum of the city in his ears. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, lawsuits, critics, obstacles, but tonight, for the first time in years, he felt aligned with something larger than himself. The ripple had begun, and it was only growing stronger. 6 months after Flight 857, the world of aviation and beyond looked noticeably different. What had begun as a humiliating moment in a first-class cabin had grown into something far larger, something that reshaped the very culture of service, dignity, and accountability. At Legacy Airline's headquarters, the latest Equal Sky report was projected onto a massive screen in the boardroom. The numbers spoke louder than any press release could. Passenger bias complaints down 73%. Resolution rate 96% within 72 hours. Employee retraining completion 98% across all crews. Customer satisfaction scores the highest in company history. Sophia Miller stood at the front of the room, her voice proud but steady. This is proof that change isn't just possible, it's measurable. Equal Sky is not a slogan anymore. It's a system that works. Around the table, executives nodded. Even Michael Torres, once the most hesitant, admitted quietly, "The numbers don't lie. Culture is shifting. We're seeing it every day." Dominic Hayes listened in silence, his hands folded. He wasn't interested in applause or victory laps. What mattered to him was that the data reflected what passengers felt in their bones: respect. Across the industry, the ripple had become a tide. Rivals announced their own reforms, some mimicking Equal Sky, others innovating further. Hotels, rideshare companies, even banks began releasing transparency reports. The words Equal Sky had become shorthand for accountability, invoked in congressional hearings, corporate boardrooms, and classroom discussions alike. For Dominic, it was both humbling and sobering. He hadn't intended to start a movement, but the movement had found him. Meanwhile, the personal stories of those connected to Flight 857 had taken their own paths. Catherine Monroe had withdrawn from public life in the immediate aftermath. The ridicule was harsh, relentless. For weeks, her name was synonymous with entitlement. Invitations vanished. Friends distanced themselves. She sold her Manhattan apartment quietly and moved to a smaller place in Boston. But shame had given way, slowly, to reflection. Catherine began volunteering at a community center, tutoring teenagers who reminded her painfully of the young man she had dismissed that day. At first, she showed up out of obligation, a way to repair her image. But gradually, something shifted. Listening to their stories, she began to see how blind she had been, how her assumptions had caused harm that went deeper than embarrassment. She avoided the cameras, the interviews, the chance to explain herself. Instead, she let her actions speak quietly. Those who saw her transformation weren't sure whether to call it redemption or penance. But for Catherine, labels no longer mattered. What mattered was listening, and learning and doing better. Brenda Collins had faced her own reckoning. The airline suspended her immediately after the incident, and for a time she thought her career was over. But Dominic, against the advice of some, chose not to ban her from aviation permanently. Instead, he offered her a path retraining, mentorship, and eventually the chance to help design Equal Skies crew training modules. At first, Brenda resisted, ashamed of the scrutiny. But as she worked alongside diversity educators and psychologists, she realized she had something valuable to offer, not expertise, but experience. She knew firsthand how easy it was to fall into keeping the peace rather than standing for justice. And she was determined to help others avoid the same mistake. 6 months later, Brenda had become one of the most effective trainers in the program. Her sessions raw and honest. "I failed once," she told new hires, "but failure is only permanent if you stop learning." Her teenage daughter, once embarrassed, now spoke with pride when classmates mentioned her mother's role in Equal Sky. Emily Carter, the young law student who had pressed record, found herself at the center of opportunities she had never imagined. Her video was now studied in media courses and civil rights seminars. She received internship offers from major advocacy groups, even job offers from news outlets. But Emily chose a different path. She continued her studies, determined to become a civil rights attorney. "I don't just want to record injustice," she told her professors. "I want to fight it in court." Dominic kept in touch with her, offering mentorship. He saw in Emily a reflection of his younger self, fearless, but unsure of the road ahead. He reminded her often, "Truth has power, but only if you carry it with responsibility." And then there was Dominic himself. 6 months after the incident, he stood once again at a podium, but this time not in crisis. It was the annual shareholders meeting, streamed live around the world. The hall was filled with executives, investors, employees, and journalists, all waiting to hear the state of legacy airlines. Dominic began as he always did, with the numbers, profits, routes, innovations. But then he shifted, his voice steady, his eyes scanning the room. 6 months ago, this company was forced to confront a truth we had ignored for too long. We were tested not in our balance sheets, but in our humanity. Equal Sky was born not from strategy, but from necessity. And today, it is no longer just our protocol. It is becoming an industry standard, a global expectation. Applause rippled through the hall. Cameras flashed. "But let me be clear," he continued. "We are not finished. Dignity is not a destination. It is a practice, a discipline, something we must choose every day. As long as passengers question whether they belong, as long as employees fear speaking out, our work remains unfinished." His words settled over the room, not heavy, but purposeful. Afterward, as the crowd dispersed, Dominic lingered alone on stage, looking out at the empty chairs. He thought of the journey, Catherine's sneer, Brenda's hesitation, Emily's courage. He thought of the millions who had seen themselves in his story. For a moment, he allowed himself to feel the quiet weight of it all. He was not just a CEO. He had become a symbol, whether he wanted it or not. Later that evening, back in his office, Dominic stood by the window, the skyline glowing against the dusk. He pulled out a notebook, one he carried for moments like this. On the first page, he had once written a single word: dignity. Now, beneath it, he wrote another continuance. Because Equal Sky was not the end, it was the beginning. Outside, planes traced their paths across the twilight sky, tiny lights flickering against the dark. Each carried people with stories, with struggles, with worth beyond measure. And Dominic knew, as long as he had power, he would fight to ensure that every one of them flew under an equal sky. As the wheels of Flight 857 touched down, it wasn't just the end of a journey, it was the beginning of a revolution. Dominic Hayes turned humiliation into hope, silence into voice, and a single confrontation into a protocol that changed an entire industry. But let's not forget the deeper truth. For every moment caught on camera, there are countless others unseen, unspoken moments when dignity is questioned, when humanity is denied. This story reminds us that respect must never depend on wealth, power, or title. It belongs to all of us, equally. Catherine's shame, Brenda's regret, Emily's courage, each thread weaves a reminder that we all play a role. We can choose complicity, or we can choose justice. And justice, as Dominic showed, is not about revenge. It's about creating a world where no one ever has to prove they belong. So as you leave this story, carry its message forward. Love more deeply, respect more fiercely, and stand up when silence feels easier. Because change doesn't start in boardrooms, it starts with us. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe. Together, we can keep these conversations alive and keep building a sky where everyone belongs.